Okay, so welcome everyone to the last lecture of today. We are very, very happy to have Professor Andrea Albrecht here with us. Professor Albrecht did first a degree in mathematics, and then she did her PhD towards German literature. So she's actually very interested in the development of the biographical development of scientists, and especially mathematics. And she has had she was an affiliated eminent research fellow at the University of Freiburg, and currently she is a professor with a position in the University of Stuttgart. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks also for the invitation to this conference, which gives me the somehow rare opportunity to talk or speak as a literary scholar in front of mathematicians. I do not strive to give a mathematical talk, I can assure you. Instead, I'm going to speak about the character-building power of mathematics. But since this is a talk by a literary scholar, by me, I will, as a literary scholar, usually do, read my text to you. So unlike mathematicians, we do not extemporize. On the character-building powers of mathematics, the title of my talk refers to a speech the mathematician Theodor Wahl gave in 1923 as rector of the University of Greifswald on, and this is the title of the talk, The Value and Essence of Mathematics, in which he posits that an education in mathematics serves not only informing the human intellect by training the cognitive abilities, but that it has a character-building power by which it shapes the ethos, the behavior of human beings. In this talk, I will scrutinize this thesis in some detail and pursue the question whether there is indeed a causal relation between mathematics and character. I have to make two preliminary remarks. First, I'm neither interested in the mathematical schooling of formal thinking today, nor in the development of cognitive talents and abilities. I'm rather interested in what other than mathematics we learn when we learn mathematics. Second, as a historian, I'm less interested in the so-called essentialist perspective on things. Instead of trying to find out what something is really like, as philosophers or scientists, even mathematicians, most of the time do, historians try to reconstruct what people were holding to be true in former times, for example, about the character-building power of mathematics. One major presumption of historical reconstructions is that by comparing historically changing truth claims, we gain a significant insight into the contingencies of our own belief system. So the guiding question of my talk can be rephrased like this. What did mathematicians and non-mathematicians hold to be true about the question whether the intensive and prolonged occupation with mathematics lead to a characteristic behavior that can be attributed to the mathematical instruction itself? In 1933, Heinz George, a doctoral student of the psychologist F.A. Otto Schulze at the University of Königsberg, the alma mater of David Hilbert and Immanuel Kant, made a survey on the life value of mathematics as seen by the mathematical layman. Part of the life value is, among other things, the educational value of mathematics, defined as the effect that the instruction in mathematics has on the individual in non-mathematical areas, such as an influence on the strengths, abilities, and habits. In 1937, George published the results of his survey in the Zeitschrift für angewandte Psychologie und Charakterkunde, the Journal for Applied Psychology and Characterology. The questionnaire was sent to more than 1,000 test subjects. 360 responses were evaluated. This is how George summarizes the result of the survey. It is explicitly by the following qualities of character that the respondents believed to be attributed to mathematics instruction: decisiveness, drive, energy, cold-bloodedness, self-reliance, self-restraint, self-discipline, self-criticism, consistency of actions, determination, concentration, perseverance, stamina, thoroughness, precision, punctuality, cleanliness, sense of order, accuracy, diligence, dependability, and so on. As all empirical psychological studies, George's survey focuses on the current contemporary situation, the 1930s.
Yeah.
As a historian of science, I naturally wonder what the answers to this call would have been in other periods of time. Are the qualities of character attributed to mathematicians constant over time, or are they subject to historical change? A closer look at texts from the early modern times quickly shows that the tenet that mathematics does shape the character in one way or another is indeed historically invariant. In the discourse about mathematics as early as in the 17th and 18th century, it is often claimed that the instruction in mathematics has an effect on the character and the individual behavior. There is much less of a consensus, however, as to which exactly those effects are. In order to pursue this observation further, I shall present some of the historical conceptions of the character building by mathematics. Before I do that, I have to comment on my text material and introduce an important distinction. The search for texts which speak about mathematicians and their character profile turns up texts written by mathematicians as well as texts written by representatives of other disciplines, for example, by philosophers and poets. For the assessment of these texts, it makes a fundamental difference whether mathematics is viewed from the inside or from the outside. Therefore, I will distinguish auto-description or self-descriptions of mathematicians, which represent the view from the inside on the one hand, and hetero-descriptions by non-mathematicians, which represent the view from the outside on the other hand. Both types of descriptions of the mathematical character profile are abundant in the cultural history. While mathematicians may often lament their supposed cultural underrepresentation, they belong in fact to the most frequently portrayed figures in philosophical essays and treatises, novels and films, in contrast to representatives of other disciplines like chemists, archaeologists, philologists like me, or theologians. The cultural representation of mathematicians is surpassed, for obvious reasons, only by doctors, teachers, and lawyers. The European cultural history is imbued with the fascination for mathematics, which can be traced back to Plato and Aristotle and continues until today. This fascination has inspired a vast number of literary, philosophical, and journalistic texts in which mathematicians play a role, or which, more relevantly for this talk, ponder the educational and cultural value of mathematics. If you do not believe me, go to the math fiction website of Alex Kasman, which lists over 1,000 fictional texts in which mathematicians make their appearance. Kasman lists only fiction. There are tons of non-fictional texts concerned with mathematicians. From this rich reservoir of texts, I can only present a few examples to you, but I will try to cover a fairly extended period of time. I will start in the first part of the talk with mathematical self-descriptions and hetero-descriptions from early modern times. From there, I will move in the second part to the 20th century. Finally, I shall return to Theodor Fahrens and Heinz George's question about the character-building power of mathematics in the 1920s and the 1930s. First, the virtues of a mathematician in early modern times. I start with a description of the peculiarities of the character of mathematicians by one of the most famous Scottish non-mathematicians. In his Theory of Moral Sentiments of 1759, Adam Smith writes, "Mathematicians are almost always men of the most amiable simplicity of manners, who live in good harmony with one another, are the friends of one another's reputation, and to enter no intrigue in order to secure the public applause, but are pleased when their works are approved of, without being either much vexed or very angry when they are neglected." In a manner that is typical for this time, Adam Smith emphasizes the serenity of mathematicians, which rests on the uncontested certainty and relevance of their knowledge. However, he displays no interest in mathematics or in the mathematicians themselves, and has very little first-hand experience with their kind. For this reason, he does not even attempt to furnish any empirical evidence for his claims about the ironic, peaceful mind of the mathematician. Statements like this, which are often to be found with non-mathematicians in the 17th and 18th century, do not aim at an adequate representation of mathematicians. It is an idealized image of the mathematician that is often used by philosophers like Smith as contrast and example for their own peers. The supposedly typical character and the supposedly typical behavior of mathematicians serve to accentuate the character and behavior of poets and philosophers who, according to Smith, suffer from the uncertainty concerning their merit that brings out their own querulous habitus. I quote, "It is not always the same case with poets, or with those who value themselves upon what is called fine writing. They, the poets, are very apt to divide themselves into a sort of literary factions, each cabal being often avowedly and almost always secretly the mortal enemy of the reputation of every other, and employing all the mean arts of intrigue and solicitation to preoccupy the public opinion in favor of the works of its own members and against those of its enemies and rivals." The ironic, peaceful mathematician on the one side, the querulous poet on the other. This contrast is often conjured in hetero-descriptions by non-mathematicians. But how do mathematicians view themselves in early modern times? Did they perceive themselves as harmonic and ironic characters? Which educational value did they attribute to their own discipline? An instructive example is given by Joachim Jungius, a mathematician, natural philosopher, and doctor who spent the most part of his life in Hamburg. In his text on the propedeutic value of mathematics for the study of philosophy from 1629, he asserts that, I quote, "Mathematics, in particular the abstract kind, outdoes all other disciplines by following two peculiarities. It states its theories without any ambiguity or obscurity, and it proves them promptly. By the first of these distinguished virtues, it suppresses all divergent interpretations, by the second, all controversies and potential refutations." Jungius explains the scarcity of controversies in mathematics with the unambiguity and clarity of mathematical knowledge and the mathematical method of proof. In contrast to the unclear and unsteady sciences of physics and metaphysics, he writes, "In mathematics, disputes among peers are extremely rare, and in the case that they do occur, they do not last long and are eradicated by knowledgeable scholars swiftly and unanimously like counterfeit money." Jungius does not leave it at the simple and somewhat self-serving praise of the mathematical character, though. He uses his description as basis for a plea to install mathematics as a propedeutic discipline for philosophers. If someone takes first to the disciplines that are dialectic and heuristic, that is, that are taught by the employment of controversies, philosophy and metaphysics, etc., he will amend the obscure style of Euclid once he turns to geometry, whereas no style could be of a less ambiguous and obscure nature, but on the contrary, not any clearer. Since he does not find open questions and disputes, he brings them on by himself. In a word, he seeks everywhere the constitution of his own discipline to which he is accustomed. More pedagogical and psychological arguments for an early mathematical and a late philosophical instruction like these are added by Jungius. I quote, "Mathematics requires a lively memory, whereas the controversies of physics and metaphysics demand a maturity of judgment. While a mathematical proof is already a task of great labor, settling the physical and metaphysical controversies is yet 3 times as much work in this sense. And an older student is more easily amenable to laborious tasks. Moreover, according to Jungius, mathematics offers to the thinker the opportunity to test his mind with small yet interesting questions, an offer suited better for the young and fresh mind who is not yet filled with other sublime, I quote, and useful things than for the more mature mind who will be annoyed by these childish antics. I quote, "When points, lines, angles, parallels, and centers are presented to them, the older students, and imparted with the necessary repetition, they are disgusted as from overcooked cabbage. they believe to be brought back to their childhood, and so, since they despise these childish antics, they rush to building castles, fortifying cities, measuring towers from afar, or take to other practical arts they can carry out with instruments. So forcing older students to solve mathematical problems leads them to distress and hyperactivity, whereas young people learn something for life. Jung's recommendation to begin an academic education with mathematics and continue with other disciplines which will benefit from the mathematically formed habit goes back to Aristotle and is reiterated frequently in the 17th century. It often leads to a general praise and brought forward numerous panegyrics of mathematics which were quite common at the time. Often, the praise is accompanied by a polemic against other disciplines. A particularly graphic example is provided by Erhard Weigel, the mathematician and astronomer from the University of Jena. In his text, Extractio Radicis, or the eradication of the bad republic of Christians of 1689, he writes, "For the children altogether, the Latins by the old Mr. Habitus and the Teutons by the old Mrs. Custer are persuaded and cajoled that Latin is erudite. The wisdom lies in Latin. Who does not know Latin is an idiot, a common man, who understands nothing. And even young boys, when they have furnished in memory with a bit of Latin, conjugate and decline in Latin, are haughty, proud, think more of themselves than a counselor who does not speak Latin at all. And with Latin the pride grows so large that they do not know themselves anymore." In the school of virtues, however, the calculus instills in the children humbleness toward each other, and only over mere animals who cannot learn how to calculate, the children will acquire a superiority of their minds, and that humans are far, far better than animals, whereby they are vigorously animated toward virtue by mathematics. Weigel then develops an extensive catalogue of all the virtues that supposedly distinguish a mathematician and set him positively apart from the following vices of a philologist, classical philologist: idleness, clumsiness, fatuity, carelessness, reluctance to learn, mischief, deceitfulness, disreputability, hard-headedness, pride, incorrectness and denial, haughtiness, double-mindedness and opinionatedness, alcoholophilia, feasting, restlessness, maliciousness, dawdling negligence, enviousness and partisanship, grandiloquence, impatience, hypersensitivity, enragement, audacity, malevolence, arrogance, discord, obstinacy, disrespectfulness, mockery, shamelessness, bragging, laziness, loquaciousness, ablutomania, which is the propulsion to wash, falseness, bragging, and blasphemy, intrusiveness, envy, hyperactivity, unfairness, impiousness, coldness against hope, coldness of the love to God, inaptitude for office, inaptitude for business, and so on. For those of you who know German, I brought also the German words, which are even weirder than If mathematics instruction really helps to eradicate all those faults of character, it would seem to be quite the panacea for all evils of mankind. At any rate, it is striking to what extent mathematics seem to have a positive character-building effect, at least in the eyes of scholars of the 17th and 18th century. However, and this is one of the aspects I would like to point out here, the ironic and virtuous mind of the mathematician, which is emphasized so often in these early times, does not fit the character profile of Heinz George's empirical survey from the beginning of the 20th century. An explanation might be that perhaps mathematicians have become increasingly quarrelsome over the 300 years that lie between. But a glance at the history of mathematics quickly shows that already the early modern period is riddled with fierce mathematical controversies and aggressive mathematical polemics. This rather suggests that the images of mathematicians in a certain epoch have little to do with an adequate representation of their profession, but are closely correlated with the zeitgeist, the general spirit of that time. With this assumption, I now return to the 20th century for the second part of my talk. Formal actions at a distance of mathematics instruction from the 1920s to the 1940s and 30s. What remains undisputed throughout the history and across a vast spectrum of political and pedagogical affiliations is the consensus that the occupation with mathematics does shape the character of a mathematician in a specific way, as Max Dehn put it. The Max Dehn whom topologists in the audience will know from the Dehn twists, which generate the mapping class group of a surface. A secondary function of mathematics instruction is often seen in the instruction in a certain worldview, Weltanschauung. And Georg Kerschensteiner, one of the most important pedagogues of the 20th century, even demands that mathematical instruction be in the service of character building entirely, in order to convey, in addition to knowledge, also moral, aesthetic, and certain intellectual and educational values. Mathematics instruction has the, I quote, power to discipline and form humans, as the psychologist Erich Rudolf Jenisch points out. Such hetero-descriptions of mathematics by non-mathematicians coalesce with the mathematical self-descriptions of the time. David Hilbert, for example, states in his lecture on Knowledge and Mathematical Thinking of 1922, the strength of mathematics as an instrument of education goes rather in the direction of ethics and the development of the free creative intellect. Self-reliance on the own strength, the critical eye, the energy to overcome obstacles that first seem to be unsurmountable, a will tenaciously targeted at an aim, those are the ethical strengths and qualities which to arouse there is no better means than the occupation with mathematics. No longer is there mention of the ironic and serene mind of the mathematician. Now, a few years after the lost World War, typical male virtues are en vogue. Self-reliance, resilience towards criticism and disappointments, tenacity, etc. Now mathematics is supposed to promote the optimistic view of the world that the post-war depressed Germany was lacking during that time. In the words of Hilbert, all those obstacles to the solution of a problem do not exist in pure mathematics. For the conquest of a problem or mind is the only means that is both necessary and sufficient. In the edifice of mathematics, there is no place for prophetic pessimism of any kind. On the contrary, every mathematician is convinced, which admittedly could not yet be supported by a proof, that every clearly formulated problem ought to be amenable to a complete solution. Richard Courant, who was wounded in World War I, shares Hilbert's assessment with regard to the male and optimistic virtues of a mathematician. Mathematics steers a thinker away from effeminate feelings, he writes. But he attributes yet another character-building quality to mathematics. In his essay on the general significance of mathematical thinking from 1928, he asserts, similar to Erhard Weigel some 250 years earlier, that mathematics fosters certain virtues. You will be curious to hear which virtues these are exactly according to Courant. Mathematics, we read in his essay, turns the view of the young human being toward the moral law inside him and the starry skies above him. A quotation from Kant. In reference to the second point of view lies the great educational power inherent to the scientific subjects of instruction, much more than in their formal elements of practical usefulness. If not enough room is given to the exact sciences in schools, a generation will be raised that forgets in an exaggerated, effeminate personality cult that personality is the highest fortune to the children of the earth only when they serve objective and collective goals. Here, mathematical instruction fosters the willingness to subject individual needs to overarching goals. In this sense, a mathematician is no individualist, but someone who is ready to submit to collective tasks. It remains unclear whether Hilbert's and Courant's descriptions are based on the actual experience or an expression of their wishes and aspirations. It is remarkable how their point of view differs from that of others, such as Max Dehn's, who I have already quoted a few minutes ago. Dehn was, just like Courant, a German-Jewish mathematician in Hilbert's entourage. And like Courant, he fought from 1915 to 1918 in World War I. His self-descriptions as mathematician, however, comes to the opposite conclusion. According to Dehn, Mathematics teaches self-denial, skepticism, and resignation. In most recent times, we have realized that we, too, can stumble, he writes in his speech, on the intellectual quality of the mathematician, a speech on the occasion of the celebration of the foundation of the German Reich in January 18, which he delivered in 1928. He uses his speech to plead against the scientific hubris in general and of mathematicians in particular to raise claim to a rational solution to all problems. And he argues against an all too robust scientific optimism as it was embodied by David Hilbert. He, Dehn, counters Hilbert's optimistic maxim, we must know and we will know, with his own resignative skepticism. I quote, all this makes some of us somewhat more skeptical, also with respect to more general questions. The basic assumption of every philosopher that the world can be comprehended without contradiction by human reason is no longer certain. Beyond the ignorabilis, he no longer believes in the ability of mankind to arrange its diverse knowledge in satisfactory harmony. From this skepticism, a certain resignation ensues, a sort of distrust of the intellectual faculties of mankind in general. In the 1920s, this position of Dehn is quite the exception. It is much more common to represent mathematics as an occupation that fosters the male virtues as did Hilbert and Courant. Unsurprisingly also from the right wing of the political spectrum, for example by Theodor Wahlen. Wahlen had, as Courant and Dehn, fought in World War I, where he had proven his expertise in ballistics and navigation. But unlike the social democratic German Jewish students of Hilbert, he cultivated a national conservative attitude and became in 1924 an early member of the National Socialistic Party, the NSDAP. After Hitler's rise to power in 1933, he would have a remarkable career as vice president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, the precursor of the Max Planck Society, as important member of the German Ministry of Education, and as president of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. In 1935, it was Theodor Wahlen who saw to the discharge of Max Dehn from the faculty of the University of Frankfurt. Until 1935, Dehn's military service in World War I had protected him against discharge, that otherwise was the fate of all Jewish mathematicians after the Nazis seized power. In his 1923 speech on the value and essence of mathematics, which I have already cited at the beginning of my talk, Wahlen lets us know that, I quote, mathematics strengthens and arouses the sense of reality, and when done right, harms also the will, and can thus help to raise men of action, Tatmenschen, as we need them so urgently in the present as well as in the future. According to Wahlen, it is the same qualities of character that will appear in the answers to Heinz-George's survey a few years later, military virtues such as determination and willpower. He also dwells on the traditional opposition of science and philology, which we have already seen with Erhard Weigel. I quote, any student in the middle of the quote, any student will be able to produce some essay or some rough and ready Latin translation. Solving a real mathematical problem, however, requires the tenacious will not to relent in intense thinking until the solution is found. It may be due to this property of mathematics to harm the will that great men of action often had a pronounced inclination toward mathematics. We are here reminded, for example, of the Prince Eugene of Savoy, Napoleon I, his Minister of War, Carnot, his Minister of Navy, Monge. The opinion that mathematics goes well with military virtues was already expressed by Friedrich Nietzsche. I quote, in scientific man, we find the virtues of the soldiers, their kind of cheerfulness, and ultimately their lack of responsibility. They are strict against themselves, strict against each other, and do not expect to be praised for their achievements. They are manly and have a penchant to danger. They have to prove themselves and put their lives at stake for knowledge. They hate to make big words and are a bit awkward. Gegenhaft. Probably neither Hilbert and Courant nor Wahlen would have admitted to the awkwardness, the Gegenhaftigkeit, but the virtues of a soldier, the readiness for self-sacrifice, subordination, for risk-taking and the like, can be found in abundance in the self-descriptions of mathematicians in the 1920s. At times, this is linked to racial stereotypes. Theodor Wahlen, for example, states that the Jewish mathematicians have developed a, I quote, purely logical, fiercely critical sense. They, the Jewish mathematicians, indulge in a demoralizing criticism that, I quote, assaults and overthrows what is considered to stand most firmly. The German race, however, strives to build, I quote, their works organically higher and higher. Wahlen concludes, in this way, mathematics becomes a mirror of the races, demonstrating the properties of the races in the intellectual realm with quasi-mathematical, hence irrefutable certainty. This racial point of view, too, has its precursors around 1900 and was advocated not only, as one might think, on the non-Jewish side. In the writings of the German Jewish philosopher Theodor Lessing, one can read in 1906 that, I quote, the observation of specific properties of the peoples and races would be of considerable value for the teaching of mathematics. For it is clear, he writes, that the particularities of Jewish predisposition must have been favorable toward the necessities of modern mathematics. For an intellectuality that lacks the optical element of spatial intuition, which the arithmetization of geometry must have suggested itself. The extraordinarily large percentage of scholars of Jewish descent among the founders of non-Euclidean geometry and number theory is no coincidence. Thus, the arithmetization of geometry became essentially the work of scholars of Jewish descent, like Hankel, Cantor, Schönflies, Minkowski, Wellstein, Wiener, Pringsheim. Lessing even thinks that the converse inference can be made from an outstanding mathematical achievement in abstract math to the Jewish descent of the mathematician. Das ist falsch. I quoted this here, the one also with Weierstrass, Riemann and Klein, we may suspect for purely psychological reasons some contribution of Jewish blood in their ancestry. The relevant characterological element in question here can be best described as a tendency of the mind toward fluidity and agility, as the constitution of the intellect to be versatile and detached from any particular ground. This is untranslatable, it's Schollenlosigkeit in German.
From territory, maybe.
Yeah.
Homeland.
Yeah, it's
Homeland, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Heimatlos, Vaterlandslos, etc. We see that assertions that attribute to Jewish mathematicians a specifically racial character do not always come from anti-Semites. Lessing's self-description has also little to do with what National Socialists later would call Jewish self-hatred, since he emphasized the advantages of the supposedly Jewish abstract thinking. Assertions like these merely show how influential and widely adopted racial anthropology was in the early 20th century, promising a scientific explanation of perceived cognitive differences. The National Socialists saw this promise fulfilled by the racial biology of the 1930s and therefore could base their racial ideology on a scientific foundation that had supporters across the political spectrum. The ethnological psychologist Erich Rudolf Jentsch, for example, played into the hands of the supporters of German mathematics the National Socialist movement to oust un-German, in particular Jewish mathematics and mathematicians, when he, Jentsch, denounced the, I quote, highly bred intelligence of uprooted minds that is, according to Jentsch, mostly found with Jews. Only, I quote, the glowing pathos of Jewish mathematicians, Honeckers and Cantors, as well as Jacobis, originates from the cult of the spirit of the pure logos, which is detached from everything real. A spirit that disdains, I quote, the reality and reaches in the sciences the most sublime form of Israelite church service. In contrast, according to Jentsch, the German mathematician can ignore neither his sense of reality nor his ethics. An affinity of ethos between the mathematician and the ideal type of the Third Reich is established for Jentsch once more by their soldier-like nature. By analogy, he argues that unlike the Jewish mathematician, the German mathematician is not only after certainty and security. In the type of mathematics that is characteristic for his kind, the latter would learn that there is no room for a convenient escape from the truth, which binds him, just as the soldier, to decisive action and his full combative engagement. Quite obviously, positions like these could be integrated seamlessly into the National Socialistic concept of science, as the example of the mathematician Georg Hamel shows. Hamel, now comes the next slide, was openly associated with the views of National Socialism. In January 1945, Hamel was appointed chairman of the German Mathematical Society to replace Wilhelm Blaschke. He undertook editorial duties beginning in the spring of 1935 for the Neue Deutsche Forschung, a new journal which was set up when the Germans withdrew their support from Compositio Mathematica because it was publishing too many articles by non-Aryans. Together with Wilhelm Süß and Heinrich Behnke, Hamel also served on an instruction commission set up by the German Mathematical Society. In the following years, he was closely linked to Nazi policies. His political views are reflected in his texts. For example, when in 1933, Hamel speaks of a spiritual bond between mathematics and the Third Reich. In the same text, he dwells on the question whether, I quote, mathematics had a special relation to the spirit of the Third Reich, and whether this would be of a pertinent educational value. I quote, the basic attitude of the mathematician and the soldier is heroic. Mathematics demands sacrifices, devoted intense work of the brain, which is, according to the words of our Führer, of equal value and esteem as the work of the hand. Both demand service. Mathematics is service for the truth, straightforwardness, precision. Since mathematics is in itself purely ideal, its truth only exists in our minds. Both are anti-materialistic. Such is the National Socialistic spirit in the proper sense, and such is mathematics in an analogous sense. Their existence does not depend on any experience or application. One may highly appreciate its utility, one may admit that it receives many valuable suggestions from practical experience, but its real value is independent thereof and rests in itself. Both want order, discipline, both battle against the chaos, the arbitrariness, and yet both grant freedom to the unique one who wants to take responsibility. Both severe but not cold, both can carry away their devotees with enthusiasm, and what would be more pedagogic than enthusiasm? The doctrine of blood and soil belongs therefore mathematics as obligatory part of the education till the very end. The doctrine of the mind in action. The unity of man as body, soul, and mind requires the parallel unity of the education through the body, the mother language and doctrine of blood, soil, and the active and creative mind. And the core of the latter is matter. Hard work, sacrifice, self-denial, martyrdom, public service, humbleness, submission to greater goals, sense of order, discipline, responsibility, drive, enthusiasm, passion. The inner kindredship between mathematics and the Third Reich seems to answer the question of the character-building power of mathematics with a clear yes. But the analogical relationship between a mathematician and a heroic soldier can be taken one step further yet. In the 1930s, there are voices who claim that a mathematician does not only carry out his own profession like a soldier, analogous to a soldier, which would not say much about his aptitude for actual combat, but that due to his professional ethos and his character, a mathematician would indeed make for a good soldier. Military and mathematical virtues, commander and mathematician, these now become one. Such positions can unsurprisingly be found in the writings of Georg Hamel, who was convinced that dealing with geometry especially would improve the skills to navigate and orientate yourself in the fields. Another example is the nationalistic educational reformist Peter Petersen, who writes in 1943 about the mathematician, I quote, such a life of full devotion that confronts the soldier with a state of emergency is the daily life of this exemplary scholar and mathematician who adheres to self-discipline and self-criticism. And only he who fully takes this toll upon himself will make a science that serves life. Obviously, such extreme characterological attributions are, as I hope to have convinced you by now, based on strong assumptions and are closely bound to the historic context. which brings me back to the starting point, to Heinz-George's survey on the life value of mathematics as seen by the mathematical layman of 1937. The qualities of character that the respondents believed to be owed to mathematics instruction, which included decisiveness and cold-bloodedness, should surprise you no more. They derive from the widely propagated self-image of the mathematicians of the time, who struggled to accommodate their a priori apolitical and neutral discipline to the exigencies of their historic situation. Heinz-George was fully aware of this correlation and has commented on the results of his own survey with great skepticism, for which he gives two reasons for the skepticism. First, a comparable survey for the classical philology has produced very similar results, according to which learning Greek and Latin fosters the same character profile as learning arithmetic and geometry. This, of course, puts the specificity of the attributions of certain traits of character to mathematics in doubt entirely. Second, he finds the responses to his survey unsatisfactory from an epistemological standpoint. A detailed error analysis and critique leads him to the conclusion that there are other correlations as well, so that the often heard claim that mathematics shapes the character in this or that way cannot be used to infer an actual causal relation. I quote, "The acceptance or rejection of formal application is generally determined by personal mental conditions and by inner values and attitudes, but not by objective premises. An attitude toward mathematics as a mental kindredship and sympathy is essential for the assumption of a formal action at a distance. Where this moment is missing, this attitude will not develop. Where it is weak, indifference will remain. Therefore, we arrive at the result that the unconditional assumption of a formal action at a distance of mathematics is a dogma or a naive belief. The judgment that mathematics is of a high educational value may be widespread, but it is merely traditional and uncritically accepted prejudice which cannot be trusted but has to be refuted in this general form by all means. It will be valid only for all mathematically interested and mathematically talented persons. Whether someone believes to have acquired his or her drive, self-restraint, precision, dependability, etc. by his instruction in mathematics depends on the individual attitude toward mathematics, but cannot be justified on objective empirical grounds. The often made claims about a causal relation between mathematics and character are for George, therefore, nothing more than a prejudice, a result of science, political, missionary work and propaganda that tells a lot about the time, but little about mathematics. I come to the conclusion and briefly summarize my talk. I begin with the question of what distinguishes the character and habitus of a mathematician other than his or her intelligence and mathematical competence. What is acquired by the occupation with mathematics, willingly or unwillingly, besides mathematics itself? As it turns out, from a historical perspective, this often posed question is highly controversial. In early modern times, a mathematician was expected to acquire serene, impartial, and analytic composure. In addition, the mathematical school of thinking, the habituation to exemplary precision and rigor, was seen as a propedeutic preparation for other disciplines. In the 19th and 20th century, more active traits of the character become important. In the examples which I took from the German discourse, mathematicians are more and more portrayed as men of action, Tatmenschen, as optimistic, fit, and able scientists who can stand their ground also outside their discipline, for example in politics and war, even though the opposite view can also be found. However, these debates are not specific to mathematics. Other disciplines exhibit similar discourses with strikingly similar qualities of the character that are supposed to be specific to the respective discipline. We conclude that an essentialist relation between mathematics and character cannot be inferred from such auto-representations and heterorepresentations, but only a disciplinary ideology which mostly advertises a self-serving causal relation between mathematics and an invariably positive character profile that conforms to the expectations of the time. The mathematician Hilda Geiringer has observed and formulated this with exceptional clarity. Geilinger, an Austrian Jewish mathematician who was forced together with the later husband, the tried mathematician Richard von Mises, first into Turkish, then into American exile, writes in 1922 in her essay on the world of mathematical thought, I quote, "If we wanted to close by praising the actual educational effects of mathematics instruction in the primary school or another type of school, then such remarks would have to evoke in the critical reader the same embarrassment as they have always aroused in me, when in beautiful, historic mathematical or epistemological elucidations by objective scientific authors, all of a sudden, a few phrases appeared about the objective educational power of mathematics, which deepens and strengthens the intuition, the thinking, the knowledge all in equal measure. Essentially, all this is wishful thinking." Thank you.
Are there questions?
Do we know anything about any Nether's views on the value of mathematics?
So he was rather short about everything private, everything personal. So we had a few letters by her, written by her, and he was always concerned about the well-being, the ongoing career, etc., and the feeling, the situation of her students.
Individuals, yeah.
Individuals, yes. But no, I think she's not so stupid to think about something like that in that way. So it's not an accident that most of the writers are mad, right? So when they want to become a soldier-like mathematician.
Sure.
And Max Dehn, he's really an exception. Max Dehn, maybe he's a kind of hypothesis melancholy guy or something. I don't know. So yeah, most of the writings I have are written by men. And Emil, no, I have nothing in mind that could be compared to this. Not even to Geilinger's writing. And then Emil was really focused on doing mathematics and on talking about mathematics.
One of the persons you quoted wrote that Hitler was aware of the role of mathematicians. Do you know maybe if he employed them during Second World War?
Yeah, there are a few mathematicians who were, a lot of mathematicians who were employed by Hitler. They worked for the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, for example, as in statistics and something like that. For example, they had the task to compute somehow how much food you were supposed to give to the Untermenschen, the slaves they want to make in Russia, for example, Ukraine, etc. And we have a lot of mathematicians working in this kind of field during the 30s. And then we have the Flatterforschung. I have no word for that in English. It's a kind of applied mathematics for the Nazis wanted to push forward the technology for this bomber. So what's the word for bomber? Hitler bomber. So they had a problem with the
instability,
yes.
aerodynamical instability.
Right. Yeah. So and then mathematicians were employed to improve this situation.
Also, the Mathematical Institute of Wolfach was started by the Nazis.
Yeah. Wilhelm Süß, I mentioned him
Yes.
once. Yeah, was one of this.
You have to remove his picture.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he's still a famous guy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, the question itself, it reminds me of something that goes back to Plato. I think there's a question in one of his Socratic dialogues that says, "Do the gods love things because they are good, or are things good because the gods love them?" And so it's a similar kind of question. Are mathematicians drawn towards certain character traits, or does having certain character traits draw people towards mathematics? And I think, if you look at the spectrum of mathematicians, out there, I mean, you've got people on one hand, great scientists, and then you've got people like Typemüller who are, on the other hand. So I don't know. And well, do you think maybe this sort of goes hand in hand with the sort of the progression of and advances in sort of psychology and that kind of thing that happened throughout the 20th century? people become maybe more aware of that, well, people can skew things towards, the Nazi Party or what have you and so on. And maybe people became more self-aware that no, really, there's no sort of
I'm not so optimistic, though, because I don't believe in psychology at all.
fair enough.
I'm not so optimistic. And you can still find writings like this in contemporary writings, even of mathematicians. And I didn't want to deep into this because of obvious reasons.
I have a little question from the very beginning. You were talking about the Georgia survey. And I think you said you sent it out to 1,000 people?
Yes.
Were they all mathematicians?
No, laymen, and so...
okay.
Yeah, and you can... So I have an analysis in more detail, but it's written by Master Porter's. If you're interested in it, I can give you the quotation. We do not know a lot about the author. He never showed up again in the history of science. It's just this survey, and then he somehow...
How many responses did you say you had?
360.
There's one of the dependability is one of those.
Yeah.
You think?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe.
Most of them didn't respond.
Yeah. Yeah, it might be inconsistency, yeah. But maybe it's a good source. One sociologist I asked about the survey, he said it's a good result, so to get 300 back from 1,000 asked people, so maybe it's not so bad at all.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Are there any questions?
This is only loosely related, but could you tell me, of your opinion, why there's this persistent image in popular culture of sort of the lone genius mathematician, and whether this, obviously you've read like a lot of historical text on this. Is this, did you find this was a perception that has been around for a long time, or is it only in the modern era that this guy who works on his own and never stops working, sits in a room,
No, this...
as opposed to how maths actually works, which is a lot more interactive?
Thales, for example, the Greek mathematician, he fell into a pond by just walking alone, and he didn't listen to anybody, to the woman next to him. So, and then he fell. So I think these images are really old, and they come up again and again. It just suits the purpose. So you have these images, and they really can really follow them through the history, the culture, history. The lonely one, and it's the same with this collective goal. The mathematician who's able to succumb somehow to this collective goal. It's the same, more or less. So it's just the opposite of these images. But this goes also back to mathematicians that were employed in ballistics, etc. Even in the 18th century. So they can work together well, it's a team spirit, etc. You can find it with Mendelssohn, for example, in the 18th century. And that's why they are so ironic, they're so harmonic, they love each other, they're really kind people, etc. And they can form a collective and reach a collective goal. Yeah, the images are really old. And it's more interesting to see when they come up and why. So what's the context for what's the impact of the context, of the political of the context to bring up these images again? And now I think this isolated genius, it's nice to have some people like this in films, protagonists in films. Yeah, so they are quite weird. They are, I don't know, a genius, but still a bit awkward, getting half, etc. And that's something you can show in Hollywood even.
Turing fits everything. He worked in a team, he was a lone genius, he was awkward.
Any more questions? Let's thank them for